Okay, let me first and foremost introduce myself. My name is Hassan Ahmed Ibrahim. I currently work for the International Islamic University in Malaysia. I'm occupying the position of Deputy Dean for postgraduates in one of the Kulliyyahs, as well as a professor of history. Originally, I'm a Sudanese, and I've been working in the University of Khartoum for a fairly long time. But I left Khartoum in 1994, and I came to Malaysia from that time until now. I mean, this is a very, very controversial issue. I mean, the belief in a deliverer, a redeemer, somebody who will come at the end of time to fill the world with justice after it had been full with his justice. This idea of salvation is certainly not restricted to Islam. It had been known long before Islam among all religions, revealed and unrevealed religions, but particularly in Judaism and Christianity. So when we speak about salvation, it's called the Messiah in Judaism and Christianity, and in Islam it's called the Mahdi. If you follow Islamic history, there are so many pretenders of the Mahdiyya throughout Islamic history. But in Sunni Islam, or Orthodox Islam, as they sometimes call it, there are two. The two most important are, one, Muhammad ibn Tomart, that was in North Africa in the 13th century, and the second is a man, his name is Muhammad Ahmed Ibn Abdullah, but he's popularly known as the Sudanese Mahdi. So he waged a revolution, which is called in history as the Sudanese Mahdi. Now, the Sudanese Mahdi, the history may be divided into two periods, from 1881 to 1885. That was what's called the Mahdist Revolution. And from 1885 to 1898, this is what is called the Mahdist state, meaning that the Mahdists of the Sudan succeeded in establishing a state. And this is one of the very, very rare Mahdist movements that has done this, established a state. So the significance is that it did establish a state. Whatever our views about this state, but it was a state that continues for 40 years. Taking the dates in mind, 1885 to 1898, that was the peak of the imperialist era, when Africa was partitioned among the colonial powers. This is what's famous called the partition of Africa, or the scramble of Africa, sometimes it's called. So the significance that this independent state in the Sudan had been established at that height of imperialism. Now, so in this sense, the Mahdist revolution is a nationalist revolution against European imperialism, and in this case, British imperialism. But I think the other more important dimension of the Mahdiyya, rather than being a local movement of national liberation, it is a revivalist movement. The 19th century in Africa is the century of Islamic revivalism. We have a series of Islamic revivalists. I think the most notable of them all in what's called Sudanic Africa is Uthman Danfodio in West Africa, what's now known as Nigeria. In fact, he's in northern Nigeria. So this global, international dimension is, I think, more important than the local aspect of the Mahdiyya. So it is it has two hats. One, the liberation movement of national liberation against European imperialism, but more importantly, it was part of Islamic revivalism. It was part in Islamic nomenclature, it was a Tajdeed movement. So this is the significance of the Sudanese Mahdi. The leadership was, of course, Faris the Sudanese Mahdi, when he died immediately after the success of the revolution. In June 1885, he died natural death. And before his death, he appointed his successors, whom he called Khalifas. And I think it's very interesting to note here that the Sudanese Mahdi tried to emulate the Prophet in many respects. One of them is that he called the four Khulafa, just like Al-Khilafah al-Rashida, that is in the first Islamic state history, there were four Khalifas, so the Sudanese Mahdi appointed his four Khalifas. But his first Khalifa was Khalifa Abdullah, who is from the western Sudan. In particular, we could say he's from Darfur region now. So Khalifa Abdullah was the man in charge of the Mahdist state. As I said, the Mahdi died. So from the formation of the state in 1885 until its collapse in 1898, it was under the control of Khalifa Abdullah. So the 15 years of Khalifa Abdullah are very, very essential and important because he was the leader. He was the actual leader. There were so many works produced about the Khalifa Abdullah. But I think the most important thing is that he sincerely tried to implement the teachings of the Mahdi. And the teaching of the Mahdi, one of the most important aspects is that the Mahdiyya was not, as I said, a national movement of liberation, but it was a jihad movement to spread Islam throughout the world. Because of this, in fact, the jihad, we could say, was the cornerstone of the foreign policy of the Mahdiyya. And Khalifa Abdullah insisted that the jihad should be conducted in all fronts. This was, I think he was faithful to the Mahdist teaching, but of course it led to many problems. For example, the Emperor of Ethiopia suggested to the Khalifa Abdullah and his commanders to have an African alliance against European imperialism. But because the Khalifa was faithful to the teaching of the Mahdi and to the ideology of the Mahdiyya, he insisted that the emperor should be converted to Islam before thinking about any. So those of us who speak about African or Pan-Africanism, the Khalifa, his concern was not Pan-Africanism, his concern was Pan-Islamism. That is to have, and that is also reflected in before him, the Mahdi, and he himself sent so many letters to the leaders of the world inviting them to join, to believe in Islam and in the Mahdiyya. So this is in terms of foreign policy, that it was a kind of, as I said, the jihad was the most important. Because of this engagement in the jihad and in wars to spread Islam, there were many internal problems. And those internal problems had caused a lot of trouble to the country at that time. So it isolated it from the outside world. There was economic hardship, there were political problems here and there, but it is in that kind of atmosphere, for that state to continue for 14 years, I think this reflects the determination and perhaps the charisma of the leadership. The Mahdi first and the Khalifa after him. Due to these so many problems, and one other important aspect is that by that time Britain occupied Egypt in 1882. So the British occupation of Egypt dragged Egypt into the affairs of the Sudan, because the Sudan was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Muhammad Ali's family, that's an Egyptian family, on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. So when the British occupied Egypt, so they became morally responsible to protect Egyptian interests in the Sudan. So they were dragged into this conflict. There were so many attempts by the British to disassociate themselves from the Sudan, from the affairs of Sudan, but finally they felt that that is not possible. So gradually they were involved, and so although it was a declared policy to leave the matter to the Egyptian government, but as I said, because they were controlling Egypt, so they have to engage in the affairs of the Sudan. And that ultimately, first of all, they sent some of their generals to work under the Egyptian government, paid by the Egyptian government, under the service of the Egyptian government, but many of them were killed in battle during the Mahdist revolution. I would mention General Hex in the Western Sudan, but more importantly, General Gordon, this legendary figure who had been assassinated by the Mahdists, whom incidentally the Mahdi called his supporters the Ansar, and this is another parallelism with the Prophet, because the Prophet called those who supported him as the Ansar. The Ansar means, Yansur means to support. So the Ansar killed General Gordon in 1885, June 1885. This led to an outcry in Britain. So this plus other factors finally triggered the British to decide to end the Mahdist state, and that this decision was taken in March 1896. And one other implication here is that one of the motives for this decision, apart from protecting Egyptian interests in the Sudan, the other one is that in March there was a significant development in the Eastern Front. That was the Mahdists defeated the Ethiopian emperor at the battle, defeated the Italians at the battle of Adwa. And this was another external factors which persuaded the British to invade the Sudan, or what they say, to reconquer the Sudan. So finally, they sent an expedition. Interestingly, this expedition was manned by Egyptian soldiers, but officered by British. And the commander in general was a famous British general, General Kitchener. And within 2 years or so, to be exact, in September 1898, the Mahdist state finally collapsed at the hands of this Anglo-Egyptian army. So it came to an end at that time. After that, the British, they faced a dilemma, what to do with the Sudan. It was conquered by Anglo-Egyptian army. So they have different options. They wanted to rule the Sudan, but Egypt to pay the expenses. They wanted to be in command, but they don't want to spend on the Sudan. So they have to find a formula that will satisfy this. The outcome was what is called the condominium agreement, whereby the Sudan became a condominium. Condominium meaning it was ruled by two powers, Britain and France. It's called the Egyptian condominium agreement. But in essence, it was British that was ruled, because in this agreement, it was clearly stated that the supreme civil and military command of the country will be under a British general, to be called the Governor General. So throughout what became known as the condominium period from 1898 to 1956, all the Governor Generals were British. So in other words, the Sudan, it was a de facto British colony, although technically it was called a condominium. So what happened to the Mahdists after that? I mean, the British considered the Mahdists as enemy number one, and they decided to crush them, and crush them violently. The policy they adopted is policy of suppression and non-recognition. So what they did, in fact, they rounded up Mahdist military commanders. They either killed them or imprisoned them. So the Mahdist, as the first Governor General, whose name, the second Governor General, his name was Wingate. Kitchener became the first Governor General, but he continued only for 1 year, and he was succeeded by General Wingate. And General Wingate, after the collapse of the Mahdi state, sent a famous letter to his wife, and he said, "Hooray! Mahdism vanished. Mahdism vanished from the Sudan." And so he thought that that was the end of the Mahdiyya. And the Mahdiyya could have vanished because of this policy of suppression and recognition, had not a new leader emerged to reverse the story. The new leader was the eldest, was a surviving son of the Sudanese Mahdi. His name is Abdurrahman. And Abdurrahman had masterminded a complete transformation in the orientation of the Mahdiyya, both political and religious. In other words, he felt that his father's policies of confrontation with the West will be counterproductive. They will not be fruitful neither to the Sudan nor to the Mahdists. And so he wanted to change, or he planned to engineer a complete change in the orientation of the Mahdiyya, as I said, from extremism in politics to moderation in politics, from dogmatism in religion to realism in religion. So he changed the whole orientation. And through this intelligent approach, he managed to gain gradually the support of the British, because he collaborated with them. But his collaboration was not out of loyalty to the British, it was out of loyalty to himself and his movement. So through tactical cooperation, I think, through manipulation, he managed to gradually rebuild the Mahdiyya with this change of orientation. And this dramatic change in orientation warranted that the movement became known as Neo-Mahdism. So in other words, you have the historical Mahdiyya of the 19th century, which we have already talked about, and then you have Neo-Mahdism of the 20th century. And I think due to this pragmatic, realistic approach, which gave up violence, gave up extremism, and decided to follow a peaceful orientation In other words, the jihad of his father was the jihad of the sword, but he decided to follow another jihad, which is the jihad of the words. In other words, through peaceful, and later on the Mahdists called it civil jihad, jihad al-Madani in Arabic. So through this, Abdurrahman al-Mahdi managed to rebuild the Mahdist movement, and through patience, through pragmatism, through realism, he gradually, and through manipulation of course, he gradually, step by step, rebuilt the Mahdist state, revised its organization under his leadership, and by the end of the day, the British suddenly realized that the movement which they fought in the 19th century and wanted to end it revived in a new form. It's moderate, but under a new political party, which is called the Ummah Party, People's Party, and through a new organization which is called the Ansar organization. So the political wing of Neo-Mahdism is the Ummah Party, the religious wing is the Ansar organization. And this ultimately, through this, ultimately Abdurrahman with other political forces, he managed to attain the country's independence in 1956. And today, Neo-Mahdism is a sizable religious-political force in the country, although it has changed a lot. The present leader of the New Mahdists is the grandson of Abdurrahman al-Mahdi. His name is Sadiq al-Mahdi, who is the current leader of the movement. And the movement is trying to play a role in resolving the difficult situation in the Sudan today with other political forces. Okay?